At somewhere in the region of 520 and 550,000 words, this book is the longest novel I've ever read. It's To Green Angel Tower by Tad Williams, Book 3 in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. I'm here to talk about Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. Welcome back to StoryToob. What's the story? At the inception of this channel, I set out on a little project, long-term project, of delving into the influential works of fantasy, my little chronology of fantasy project. At that time, I was kind of looking at everything post-Tolkien and how the genre has redefined, re-evolved over the decades, and what is sort of the lineage of fantasy, and where do you see the influences and inspirations for other works, and how did the genre evolve over the last few decades. And one of the major series on that project, on that list, I made a video a couple of years ago that I wanted to complete, was Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. And 2 years later, over 2 years later, I have finally completed this 4-book trilogy with the last volume, To Green Angel Tower, the longest book I've ever read in my life. And it certainly felt long, but I'm going to talk about the whole trilogy. The Dragonbone Chair is probably one of my favorite books, but it just took me a while to come back and actually finish the series, mainly because I was a little bit intimidated by the length and breadth and girth of this beefy boy. I'll talk about the other 2 books, Dragonbone Chair, Stone of Farewell. What do I think of Tad? What do I think of Memory, Sorrow and Thorn? And then finally, what did I think of To Green Angel Tower? Starting with the Dragonbone Chair, I've said it's probably one of my favorite books I've ever read. If you also watched a video that I made about my favorite fantasy beginnings, I'm a big fan as a reader of those sort of humble fantasy beginnings. And that kind of traditional, the farm boy, or in this case, the kitchen boy, or the scullion who gets swept up on an adventure larger than themselves. I find the coziness of that very comforting, reassuring. I like getting swept up in a new world, discovering the magic, discovering everything about it. There's a sort of a wonder to it all. And I think my favorite thing about Tad Williams is how he displays that in his writing. There is a love for discovery and wonder in the way he writes. It's very charming. And this trilogy is, above everything, extremely charming. And it's my idea of cozy fantasy. The Dragonbone Chair starts with young Simon working in the kitchens of the castle of the Hayholt in Erkenland, which is very obviously England. And I'll get on to more about the world when I talk about To Green Angel Tower, but I think in the first book and in the second book, the world of Ostenard that Tad Williams created is very basic to me, especially as somebody who I've grown up with a knowledge of the cultures of Western Europe. It is very obviously Ostenard at the beginning, very obviously setting up as Erkenland is England, Hernister is Ireland, Scotland, sort of a mashup of the Celtic Gaelic languages. There are countries in the south of Tad Williams' world that sort of are analogues for Greece, Italy, and then to the north there's Rimmersgard, which is very obviously the Nordics. I just find this sometimes in fantasy to be a little tired and lazy. However, as the series kind of goes on, there's a lot of richness added to that, and maybe some commentary, real social commentary, on how history is written and how lands kind of develop, and who does that land belong to, and what do we know to be true about countries, places, cultures. So initially, I think with the Dragonbone Chair and then with Stone of Farewell, I was fairly unimpressed with the world, but towards the end I think I grew a different level of appreciation for it. I'll get more on that later. Dragonbone Chair to me is almost perfection in what I like with fantasy beginnings. To me, it's my idea of cozy fantasy because of Tad's kind of warm, cozy, inviting writing style. I just sort of sunk into it and everything was new. So I was along for whatever Simon was doing roaming around the castle. I know it's a criticism of that book that it takes a long time for him to set off on the adventure. But I think once we set off on adventures in fantasy, quite often I find that because I generally know the destination, a lot of the journey can seem repetitive. And to me, in the Dragonbone Chair, I actually like when we're not setting off on the journey, when we're just sort of exploring the castle, we're learning about the world, and then when he does set off on the adventure, I don't immediately know where he's going. We build up then to a very climactic ending. And it's probably one of my favorite endings in fantasy is the end of the Dragonbone Chair. So that's one of my favorites. I read that a couple of years ago. And then 2 years ago, I came back and I read Stone of Farewell. And Stone of Farewell started off amazingly. And then I found it painfully slow and repetitive. And I think I was a little harsh on it at the time. I didn't necessarily read it at the right time. We were traveling. I was lugging around this chunky book. There were a lot of repetitive scenes, so I was losing patience with it. And I kind of soured my view on the series then a little bit. But I always wanted to come back and find out what happened, find out how the story unfolded, what the resolutions were. I have a great fondness for many of the characters. So I figured, why not read To Green Angel Tower over Christmas, which is a very cozy time anyway, and I was looking forward to it. So building up that anticipation again was part of the reason I really enjoyed To Green Angel Tower more than Stone of Farewell. But I think a lot of the strengths that I found in the Dragonbone Chair exist here, and a lot of the weaknesses that I found in Stone of Farewell were kind of exacerbated in this book. It sort of knocks the whole series down, or the whole trilogy down a little bit, just how repetitive Tad can be. There are many scenes that kind of serve the same function. I felt like Stone of Farewell was very just putting pieces in place, very middle book. Learned a little bit more about what was going on, what was unfolding, a little bit more of the Scythi and the Norns and the other races that give a richness to the world. And that really ramped up into Green Angel Tower, and especially in the first half. So in the paperbacks, you see them behind me here. This book is split into two 800-page paperbacks. And I found this cool first edition hardcover in our local secondhand bookshop. And I think between sometimes reading this when I'm at home and sometimes reading out of the other two paperbacks, the experience was kind of changing each time. When I was reading out of the hardcover, I wasn't feeling the length of it, but when I switched to the paperbacks, I was. And I find that pretty interesting. But I will say that the first half, so basically the contents of the first paperback, I flew through. And I thought it was pretty flawless. And then around the middle of the book, there's probably 300 to 400 pages a section that I found kind of tedious. And it almost soured me to the point of not continuing, but I decided to power through, and the book took me like 2 months to read. And honestly, for a book that is this long, I don't think that's an insanely long time to read a book. But I was picking up a lot of other things instead of coming back to the book during that middle section. And I think I was stuck on the same 300-400 pages for the vast majority of the time I was actually reading the book. And then the last chunk, maybe the last 300 pages or so, I kind of flew through. And where all the resolutions start happening and you get Simon returning to the Hayholt after all of his adventures through the other two books, I found it quite moving at times. There are some characters that I can't really mention because of spoilers. I don't want to get too into spoilers. The basic premise is there's 3 magic swords. There's a sort of evil being that is coming back to life, trying to reclaim stolen land or revenge for something that happened in the past in the world. And Simon and our main characters, Binabik, Joshua, Miriamel, they're learning more and more about the history of the world, kind of joining into an adventure that he doesn't yet understand. In the Dragonbone Chair, it is that unknown that kind of drives the motivation to keep reading. And then in the Stone of Farewell, they are going to a place called the Stone of Farewell, which is a magical, historically important place for the other races, the City and the Norns. And he gets sent to this place based on like visions he's having. And we learn pretty early that we need to go to this spot. I think what my issue with Stone of Farewell was knowing the destination immediately set a sort of expectation of we need to get to this place. And everything that happens to get there is in function of getting to the Stone of Farewell. And I don't think that Tad justifies the sort of repetitive nature of some of the scenes and character beats and world building required to get there. It felt like a lot of padding. He overdoes it. And into Green Angel Tower, when I feel like things should be starting to hit a resolution for his story and the plot, he just spends more and more time describing things and then also reinforcing character motivations through little plot points that we already know. So like we don't learn many new things about certain characters in the third book. For example, the character of Joshua, who I really liked in the first book and most of Stone of Farewell, into Green Angel Tower, I don't really learn anything new about Joshua. And there are a lot of scenes that are designed to tell you how Joshua is feeling, and it's never really anything new, or there's no real sense of progression, in my opinion, for a character like that. Simon, for example, kind of stays very much the same into Green Angel Tower compared to his kind of journey to maturity, especially in Stone of Farewell. I think Simon is at his most interesting in Stone of Farewell, dealing with mortality, dealing with the dangers of the world. But I think the biggest strength of To Green Angel Tower, and specifically in the first half of the book, is learning all about the Scythe and the Norns. And there is one specific character, for anybody who's read it, a person who is thought to be dead that we realize is not dead. And that character is really interesting and probably the best character in the book and sort of a tragic figure. And I think that plotline was arguably the most interesting of the third book. Again, the strength that Tad maintains throughout the three books is just his charm and his love for fantasy and his love for storytelling. He's got these little quirks in his narration that just add a level of whimsy that is very cozy. But I do find that his narration at times is often incredibly meandering and repetitive. And not just repetition in language, but repetition of like plot beats or character moments or bits where we're theoretically supposed to learn something new, but we don't really. And I feel like in the third book especially, he's almost trying to convince us, the reader, and himself that it's all more complex than it really is. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't lack for some depth and some richness. Because I feel like the Scythe and the Norns are really the heart of what he's trying to get at in this series. You can see the influence and the foundations of modern fantasy in his writing and how he helped fantasy sort of reach a next level of really examining the complexity of good guys, bad guys, and who should be ruling countries and all of this kind of stuff that is in fantasy. But in more traditional stuff, it's like, oh, the heroes defeat the villains and they all die and we all move on and live happily ever after in our newly created world. Tad is really kind of operating in the gray there with what is the right thing and who is really doing right. And I think that the three books, the most exciting thing about this trilogy is I feel like it's one long prologue to a more interesting story. And I am more interested in where Tad is going to go later with the Last King of Ostenard books. Especially since we've learned more about the Scythe and the Norns and this sort of revenge quest that Inaluki the Storm King was on. It just makes me want to learn more about that and explore that richness of the world. And I think that maybe Memory, Sorrow and Thorn was almost a primer for him reaching that. Obviously, I haven't read those books yet, but that's kind of what I felt like with Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. Like, the story very much is not done. But like I said, it's the charming nature of Tad's writing that is really the selling point here. It's also seeing where it lies in the lineage of fantasy and the clear influence that he's had on George R. R. Martin, who I think kind of perfected some of the ideas that Tad presents in these books. But it makes me really glad to have read them, because it's basically what I want from this little project that I have. I find fantasy to be a little more insular as a genre. It's not quite as broad in scope and in types of books as a genre like science fiction that has kind of a bit of everything, a lot of variety and a lot of different styles and kinds of books. I find fantasy to be a little more insular in that sense. I could be wrong, but I like seeing that sort of lineage of one influence over the other. It's more clear than in fantasy to me. And I'm very glad to read somebody who is clearly influential on modern fantasy and kind of a bridge between Tolkien and older classic fantasy to modern era fantasy of George R. R. Martin, Brandon Sanderson, those kinds of authors. I didn't get too much into the plot of the series. It's fairly traditional epic fantasy. Like I said, Simon gets swept up in an adventure bigger than himself. There are other races. There's the Scythi and the Norns, who are basically forgotten or disregarded peoples who had initially inhabited the world, and the race of men exiled them. And I think Simon goes on this journey of discovering the history of the world and why these things have happened, and also his own lineage. So the main thing for me is feeling a sense of real satisfaction at finishing such a long series, and having a real sense of having read a benchmark, a sort of landmark of fantasy. And I think it's a very important series to read if you're into fantasy, and especially if you've read a lot of modern fantasy and you want to go back and see the bridge between Tolkien and Sanderson, for example. I think Tad Williams is a hugely important author in fantasy. Probably is underappreciated, but I think some of the reasons for that are perhaps timing, when he was writing, when he was publishing, and also he's very repetitive and very long-winded, and that's just not going to work for a lot of people, and he certainly tested my patience. But persevering with him is extremely rewarding and very worth it, even though the books are flawed. I think book one is almost flawless. I also read that one at the right time as well. I also read that over Christmas a few years ago. So coming back to Green Angel Tower this time as well, I decided to read it at Christmas, and he creates an atmosphere and a vibe that I think is pretty unmatched. And another thing I really want to highlight about Tad Williams is, for a man, for a white man writing fantasy in the 80s and 90s, he is surprisingly quite progressive. And I think this is a huge element of influence that he's had on George R. R. Martin as well. Just in certain things, certain very subtle elements of how he writes women, how he writes power dynamics, these kinds of things. There's a psychological realism where Tad kind of shows that he's a little bit ahead of his time in how he deals with some of those topics. So overall, I'm kind of feeling a curiosity as to where Tad Williams goes with the Last King of Ostenard books. I am very curious to read the novellas that he's written, or, well, the novels. They're just 200 pages instead of 1,000. I'm very interested to learn a little bit more about the history of the world, how it came to be the way that it is in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. So I think that kind of retroactively discounts maybe some of my criticisms of the world itself in the early stages of the series. And I think that's very cool. So I think Tad Williams should absolutely be recognized among the greats of fantasy. And he is quite clearly an influential author on a lot of modern works. And I think his charming style and approach to what I consider to be cozy fantasy is the essence of what traditional epic fantasy is. I think he displays everything that traditional epic fantasy should be, but at least in Memory, Sorrow and Thorn, he is just too long-winded and repetitive to really be considered among the top 3, maybe, at least for this series, among my absolute favorites. I hope that maybe he learns to be a little less repetitive in the next series of books, but I'll probably be getting back to Malazan next, so it'll be a while before I find out. I highly recommend that you read Memory, Sorrow and Thorn if you're a fantasy fan, if you want to go back and look at the kind of lineage of modern fantasy. I think Tad Williams is an essential author to read. I'm very excited to eventually check out The Last King of Ostenard, because I think that's where my interest is really going to lie, with this world and this story and these characters. I do have to say that Binabik the Troll is probably one of my favorite characters I've read in fantasy, so a special shout out to Binabik. If you have read the trilogy and you think I'm dead wrong or dead right about any of my thoughts, please let me know in the comments. If you've read The Last King of Ostenard, do you think that I'm gonna enjoy those books? Do you think I'm gonna enjoy them more than Memory, Sorrow and Thorn? Do you think I'm gonna enjoy them less than Memory, Sorrow and Thorn? Let me know. And if you like this video, give it a like. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. I'll be talking about more Malazan soon, probably. I'll be talking about loads of other books. So stick around, and thanks for watching this one. I'll talk to you next time.